Back with you tonight on In Focus. Thanks for staying on. Government has promised to ensure the independence of the media and respecting media in the country. It comes as the 30th anniversary of World Press Freedom, which is celebrated globally today, is being observed. For more on this, we're joined now by Stellenbosch University's Professor Herman Wasserman, as well as William Bird from Media Monitoring South Africa, to help us in the conversation. Gentlemen, good evening. Good to have you, and thank you very much for your time tonight here on In Focus. A day when professionals in the sector, in the media, but also other stakeholders reflect on press freedom and professional ethics in this particular space, and we'll try and touch on those. But this day, of course, comes on the back of William Bird, back and forth with government on the appointment of the board at the SABC, but also we are looking at how a media entity exposed possibly one of the biggest stories that we are talking about now, an escape at one of our correctional facilities. When you look at both those instances, and by and large the involvement even of politicians in all those stories, how free is our press in South Africa?
Well, you know, it's a bit like the stories that you revealed. It tends to occur on two extremes, right? You've got incredible levels of amazing journalism where they reveal things, they expose things, they put their lives at great risk to reveal things, including the Gupta leaks, from the Gupta leaks to the National Lotteries Commission stories, to more recently the Thabo story. And then you see things where the media often are their own worst enemy, where they undermine media freedom in the way that they behave. You think of the couplet story, for example. There are a number of other instances where media act contrary to their own best interests, and then you've got some in government who think that it's a good idea to try and undermine media freedom, either through their direct actions of seeking to, as the previous minister did, interfere in the affairs of the board, or you get it through indirect measures where they attack and undermine the credibility of the media. So you've got quite a mixed sort of a notion of what really constitutes media freedom, and of course you're then getting journalists attacked regularly online. So, but as a constitutional democracy, there's still very high levels of media freedom. We are significantly better than countries where you aren't even allowed to criticize the leadership or the president without, for example, risking being put in jail or being harassed or murdered, just taken out. There's certainly a lot of things we can be pleased about.
Would you say we should count ourselves lucky, because the UN speaks of, when they speak of press under attack, as you put it, they actually speak of people being not just harassed on social media, but actually being taken out?
Well, yes and no. There are a lot of really good things there, but there's also a lot of things to be deeply worried about. When our journalists are routinely attacked or undermined on social media, you've got a former president taking a journalist to court over something which seems clearly an effort to undermine and belittle the ability to report, and then you've got them effectively sanctioning her being trolled on, ruthlessly on social media, and that happens to a number of journalists. We've seen Newzroom Afrika journalists attacked by politicians, by political parties. So there are definitely some very worrying signs by people that don't seem to register the difference and the critical importance. It's one thing to be a politician, but you're there by virtue of the rights in a democracy, and part of that democratic right and part of that structure is the critical importance of having journalism. And if you don't support one, and if you allow people to undermine it, you're necessarily undermining your own ability to function in a democratic state.
I'll come back in a moment to that, and whether or not we appreciate that relationship between press freedom and how important it is in a freedom in general. Just the other day we were celebrating Freedom Day. But Prof, let me bring you in here. I started off by saying we were sitting in a situation where we were waiting for a politician to finally appoint a board at a public broadcaster. Are we maintaining a healthy enough distance between the powers that be and the press in the country?
Well, I think in general there has always been a healthy tension in the democratic era between the press and the government. I think that tension is inherent in press relations with governments in democracies. And I think we've been doing well in that regard. I think the SABC, of course, is to some extent an exception in that regard, and we have seen some worrying instances of editorial interference in the past, and in this case, we've seen also problematic situation where the board wasn't appointed for a long time, which raises questions around the public accountability and the governance of the public broadcaster. But I think in general, we have quite a robust media, a media that is very brave, very outspoken, that has done really important work in the last number of years to unearth big scandals of corruption in government and elsewhere. So I think in that regard, we can be very proud of what our media has achieved in the last number of years.
Yeah, and the question is how then the tensions. My suspicion is that the more factional battles are being fought within political parties, especially the ruling party, the media almost becomes a casualty of that to some extent. How have the intense fighting of the political elite impacted on how the media interacts with that story?
Well, I think you would often see. I think that's to be expected that the different factions in politics will strive to dominate the media agenda, try to make their voices heard. I think I maybe flip the question around a bit and also say that it's important for the media also to cover politics, not only in terms of like a boxing match and sort of fighting factions against each other and see who's scoring the most points, but asking substantive issues. I think as we're going into elections next year, I think it will be really important for the media to use this freedom responsibly to ask substantive, informed questions around policy, and not only focusing on the personalities, and certainly not only doing this sort of stenography that that you'd only repeat press releases and what politicians say today and what they say tomorrow, as if you were just commenting on a sort of sports match. I think it's really important that the media play that substantive role in democracy to ask deep, difficult, complex questions around policy, around elections coming up. So yes, that's, I think, a challenge for the media in the next year ahead. Yeah,
William, but back to that question. We were talking Freedom Day just the other day. People were being asked, and they said, well, there's really no freedom in South Africa. I wonder, do we appreciate what press freedom really means in the context of a free and a democratic South Africa?
Look, we need to challenge that because that's just nonsense. If you compare where we were prior to becoming a constitutional democracy to where we are now, yes, we've got massive problems and massive issues, and there's poverty and unemployment and crime and all of these terrible things. But to suggest that we know better today than we were then is just patently not true. The fact is before we became a democracy, you couldn't say what you wanted. You would be arrested. You would be jailed. Journalists were jailed routinely as a matter of course. It's just incredible to suggest that there is no freedom now. That it just simply isn't the case. As Justice Albie Sachs said recently at a talk at Prof. Wasserman's university recently, they said to him, "Is this the country that you fought for?" He said, "This is the country I fought for, but it's not the society that we need or that we want." And it's the same thing with media freedom. We've got a lot. There's a huge number of things that we can be getting right and that we need to be getting right, especially in the context of rising mis and disinformation. The media now is even more critical because you need to know that you can go to X, Y, and Z source to get news information that you can actually rely on, that's been verified, that's accurate, and that's true. 20, 30 years ago, you didn't have a Newzroom Africa. The thought of Newzroom Africa as a channel wouldn't have been countenanced. So to suggest that is just not true. And we need to fight back against that because there are significant gains and we must protect them because they are essential to our survival as a democratic state.
Prof, there is also a feeling that even independent media is not as independent as it should be because it is dictated to, certainly by those with deep pockets and those who own it. And the feeling in South Africa is that it's largely owned by a few powerful players.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the question of economic pressures, commercial pressures on media and media independence is a perennial question. That is, I think maybe the word dictated to is maybe a bit strong, but I think commercial interests, and not only in the commercial media sector, but also, in the public broadcasting sector, we have a public broadcast that also relies on commercial revenue to a large extent, for instance, community media. So yes, I think these are pressures that we need to be aware of. But a related question is also the viability of media. We just spent the whole day here today at a press freedom seminar speaking about community media, for instance. The community media sector often struggling to just survive. And when you have those sort of struggles for survival, then you become more vulnerable to outside influence, to media capture, and so on. So it is a bit of a double-edged sword. You have to remain commercially viable, you have to remain sustainable, at the same time also be editorially independent. But it's an important question. I think when we talk about independence, we often frame that in terms of government or political independence. And I think it is always important to add to that although that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be commercially viable or successful, that you should be make sure that the editorial principles and the ethical principles that underpin good journalism are not threatened by these commercial imperatives. And as William has mentioned, we have seen, unfortunately, in the last number of years, some egregious instances of unethical behavior, sort of stories just blatantly made up, like the dectuplets story, the Satchel report a few years ago, highlighting some of the editorial missteps and unethical behavior that where media got it wrong. So I think the question also is, how do you manage to remain viable and sustainable, yet remain true to the journalistic principles and ethical principles?
We continue in a moment. We'll get more thoughts, especially around the digital age, and as Prof puts it, the credibility of news reporting and what has certainly been coming out in a world where the phone is the newsroom and certainly the social media is the distribution channel. What does that really mean as far as the freedoms that we enjoy as the media, as the press in general in South Africa? Professor William Wasserman and William Bird, stay with us. We're back in a moment.
My asset. My brain. My voice. Is imagination an asset? My liabilities. Perfectionism.
I don't